Good day. The big news on the battlefields of Ukraine was further massive Russian missile attacks over the course of the day, with a particular focus on Ukrainian concentrations and infrastructure, this time in what I'm going to call Dnipropetrovsk region. That's what the Russians call it. I'm not quite sure what the Ukrainians call it today. But anyway, in this particular region, in the area near the city of Dnipro and places roundabouts, and clearly the target was the assembly areas of the Ukrainian forces, which are supposed to undertake the forthcoming offensive that Ukraine is proposing to launch. The particular point of concentration of many of these strikes was the town of Pavlograd, which is east of the Dnieper River and which is a major railway and transportation hub, and which, by the way, will be the last place left for Ukraine to defend if the Russians do drive the Ukrainians out of Donbass, if they do, after the forthcoming capture of Bakhmut, advance westwards, capture Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and start pushing west towards the Dnieper River. I doubt, by the way, that Pavlograd, which looks fairly isolated, is remotely defendable, at least not in the way that places in Donbass have been. But anyway, that does seem to me the last place, as I said, before the river itself is reached. And by the way, I remember the way back in the autumn when he was discussing the possibilities of a Russian winter offensive, Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vershinin, whilst doubting that such an offensive would in fact be launched by the Russians, he thought it much more likely that the Russians would focus on training their reservists and improving their military, the reservists that had just been called up in a major mobilization. But when discussing the possibilities of a winter offensive, Vershinin speculated that it would be delayed to March at the earliest, and said that he thought as a likely objective of this offensive from the Russians would be an advance on the south from Zaporozhye region towards Pavlograd, perhaps combined with an advance from the north by Russian forces in the Svatovo-Kremenaya area, pushing south towards Pavlograd, the two pincers, if you like, linking up and trapping the Ukrainian troops in Donbass, the remaining Ukrainian troops in Donbass. Well, that obviously hasn't happened, but it might do if Ukraine launches its offensive, about which more shortly, and if that offensive fails. The Institute for the Study of War in Washington has now very interestingly admitted that if the Ukrainian offensive fails, the Russians are likely to go on the counter-offensive themselves. And whilst I'm on this topic, I should say that I've had a really very generous email from a viewer. I'm not, again, going to identify who this person is, but it is somebody who actually does write very interesting and fascinating articles on a particular website. I'm not going to disclose more because I don't like to disclose the identity of people who send me private emails. But this person said some very kind and generous things about my comments yesterday about the fact that I'd expected a winter offensive to take place, a Russian winter
offensive to take place. And this person pointed out that, in fact, and contrary to what I'd suggested, some other people had also thought that the Russians might decide to launch a winter offensive, Colonel Douglas Macgregor being one, and that Colonel Macgregor, amongst others, thinks that probably what caused the Russians to give up on the idea of a winter offensive was not lack of military preparedness, but that the fact that the winter was unusually mild and that the ground was very soft, and that this didn't make it possible to carry out the sort of big arrow offensive that the Russians perhaps might have had in mind. Well, I'm going to say a few things about this briefly, and I don't want to devote too much time to this issue. First of all, I want to thank that person for reminding me of what Colonel Macgregor said. The second is that, like Colonel Macgregor, I personally think that at some point the Russians will launch big arrow offensives. I think comments made by people like Dmitry Medvedev suggest that the political pressure to launch these offensives within Russia is there. I doubt that that will override any military decisions, and I doubt that the Russians will launch big arrow offensives until they feel that Ukraine has been irretrievably weakened beyond hope of success, of successful defense. But I do think that at some point we are going to see big Russian advances taking place, but not before this Ukrainian offensive has been weathered. Now, the way in which that will happen is something I'm not going to speculate about, because I can't. I'm not going to speculate about the location, the direction, or any of that thing. But just quickly to add, and this is in response to that very generous email from that person, it is also important to remember that the Russian general in command, General Surovikin, who in my opinion is still the actual theatre commander, if you follow the photographs, the pictures of the meetings of Russian leaders, he's always prominently there, pointing towards maps and doing all kinds of things. General Surovikin did say in October, he did give an interview to Russian television in October, in which he said that his priority was not to launch big arrow offensives. That was not his intention. His priority was to build up Russian defenses, create these huge fortified lines, themselves, by the way, a strong argument against the Russians actually planning offensives in the winter, grinding the Ukrainians down and building up a big reserve. And it seems to me that, putting aside considerations of the weather, that's exactly what the Russians have done. Anyway, I wanted to say all of that. Let's get back to discussing what's happening. So, a major Russian missile strike, a possible Russian counteroffensive, presumably in the autumn. Perhaps Pavlograd might be the place where those Russian pincers converge, if the Russians are planning anything like that. We shall see. But in the meantime, the Russians carrying out missile strikes over 2 days, attacking Ukrainian logistics, infrastructure, all those things which the Ukrainians are trying to build up in anticipation of this offensive. Now, we've had some comments about what these missile strikes achieved from both sides. The Ukrainians, as they always do, gave a account of dozens of Russian missiles being shot down by Ukraine's defenses. Who knows? Maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong. but there's no doubt that a lot of these missiles did hit their targets. And I've noticed, by the way, that there's not been actual confirmation from either Ukraine or Russia. Well, Russia never says, never gives this confirmation, but I've not seen any actual confirmation about the total number of missiles launched by the Russians as part of these two missile attacks over the course of these 2 days. The impression I get is that the missile attacks were very big, but as I said, the exact number of missiles involved, I've not seen anybody provide an account of it. But anyway, the Ukrainians claim that they shot down a lot of their missiles. They've also admitted, however, that their air defense system is becoming weakened. And the Ukrainians also, and I must say this, claim that the missile attack on Pavlograd and some of these other missile attacks caused the loss of civilian life. And that, by the way, is indisputably true. There's no doubt at all, and I have no reason to doubt this, that some civilians died over the course of these attacks. And I'm not going to speculate or discuss how that was done, because I'm not on location and I cannot speak to this. And nor can most of the Western journalists who discuss this issue. And I will say that I've had another very interesting email, very fine email, which draws attention to a piece of journalism by a Western journalist in the Wall Street Journal, who straightforwardly alleges that one of these civilian buildings that was destroyed over the course of one of these Russian missile attacks was destroyed by a Russian missile. And this person points out absolutely correctly that the only basis for this journalist saying that is the fact that President Zelensky has said it, and President Zelensky is not believable about this. And of course, there have been instances where things that he said have turned out to be wrong. So I just wanted to just reference that point again. But anyway, what are the Russian authorities saying about these missile strikes? The Russian authorities, the Russian Ministry of Defense, says that the goal of the strike has been achieved. All designated facilities were destroyed. The work of enterprises producing ammunition, weapons, and military equipment for Ukrainian troops has been disrupted. This is about the attack on Pavlograd primarily. And there's other reports, again from Russian sources, that a chemical plant which produced fuel for Ukrainian missile systems has also been destroyed. I can't obviously confirm any of this, but that's what some reports are saying. Now, we've had some further reports about the missile strike, and this one comes from Vladimir Rogov, and interestingly he says the information about a strike on two S-300 divisions, that's presumably batteries, that ensured their air defense has been confirmed. And he says that Rogov appears to be saying that these two S-300 batteries were located again in the Pavlograd area. So again, we see evidence that the Ukrainians are being forced to push forward their air defense systems, their S-300 missiles, to try to counter these Russian bombers with their Fab 500 and Fab 1500 precision-guided glide bombs. And that this, at least according to Rogov in this case,
is exposing these S-300s to Russian attack and destruction. And according to Rogov, some of these S-300 missiles were destroyed over the course of that Russian missile strike. And of course, I can't confirm this, but Rogov has tended to be a reasonably accurate reporter of events, and he says that this destruction of these two S-300 missile batteries has been confirmed. And Rogov is also reported by TASS as saying, the locals tell me, which locals, about massive landings of missiles, obviously, on railway infrastructure and fuel and ammunition depots, which Ukrainian militants, that's his word for Ukrainian soldiers, have accumulated for the counteroffensive. Anyway, so that's about that missile strike. Now, there's been less information about what's been going on the battlefields, but there's been some information about Bakhmut, and interestingly, this time, we've had comments from General Syrskyi, the ground forces commander, and also from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, and Syrskyi appears to be saying that the situation in Bakhmut is quite complicated, which suggests that things there are not going well for Ukraine. And in fact, there were more reports yesterday of the Russians now taking more and more of Bakhmut. And I've seen, by the way, an interactive map, which appears to come from a Ukrainian source, which shows the steady advance of Russian forces, both within Bakhmut and in the areas around Bakhmut. Now, this is an interesting map in one further respect, because, of course, it's become a meme that the Battle of Bakhmut has been ongoing since, well, I think it's 11 months now. And up to a certain point, this is true. Russian forces did begin indeed to encroach on the area around Bakhmut back in the summer of 2022, as I remember. But as this map makes fairly clear, this interactive map makes fairly clear, the actual Russian offensive intended to capture Bakhmut itself, it really got underway in a big way in January after Soledar fell. There was lots of fighting in areas around Bakhmut in the weeks, as I remember, before Christmas. But the big Russian push, the big Russian advances have happened since January. And of course, that gives us a perhaps more accurate time frame for the intensity of the fighting. By the way, Prigozhin has again made certain comments. He's again complained about the fact that the Wagner forces are being starved deliberately of ammunition by the Russian Defense Ministry. This has been taken as true by lots of people, and for all I know, it is true. And he's also made comments that give the impression that up to 100 Wagner fighters were killed in a single day, which of course may also be true. What I would say about this is that I would be very, very careful about accepting comments like this coming from Prigozhin as necessarily true when they concern his personal feud with some people within the Russian Defense Ministry. This has been an ongoing thing. It's gone up and down ever since he started to speak out in January. The Russian Defense Ministry has shot back at him, fired back at him in one particular comment, denying that they have withheld artillery from the Wagner forces.
I'm not going to, as I said, arbitrate on the truth of this story. And I think people should be rather careful before they do that. It seems to me that if the Wagner troops had been denied ammunition in the way that Prigozhin sometimes implies, then their rapid advance since January in this very heavily fortified and fiercely defended area of Bakhmut would not have been possible. That's not to say that there clearly aren't tensions between Wagner and the Defense Ministry, and it's not to say also that Wagner couldn't have done with more ammunition. Of course they could have done, and more artillery support, and that's indisputable. But the Defense Ministry presumably has to decide priorities, and perhaps Wagner, or at least Prigozhin, don't want to acknowledge that there are other parts of the battlefronts that also need ammunition too. I would quickly add, before I proceed with this, that it's not only in Bakhmut that the fighting is going on. I've seen some very distressing pictures of Marinka, which has been bitterly fought over now for some weeks, months in fact. And the place, this relatively small town of 10,000 people, looks utterly devastated. It has been almost completely destroyed. I cannot see in these pictures a single complete building. And these photographs, by the way, appear on Boris Rozhin's website, Colonel Kassad. And I noticed that he now says that the Russians control 51 to 52 of the quarters, of the 59 quarters of Marinka, and that the Ukrainians only control a small sector, private sector, on the very western outskirts. And as I said, the pictures are absolutely devastating. I'm also seeing some pictures of Bakhmut, which is also, from what I can see now, largely destroyed. And I suspect that the same is true of Avdiivka. Fighting has obviously also been going on there pretty intensively. And from what I can get, the impression I get is that Avdiivka has been largely destroyed as well. And of course, Russian aircraft with their Fab 500 and Fab 1500 bombs are now active in all of these places: Avdiivka, Bakhmut, Vuhledar, where they're destroying the high-rise buildings, and of course Marinka. And I'm not saying that it is only they who have achieved these effects, these devastating effects, but frankly, these pictures are horrifying. They're very grim. They give a very dark picture of the nature of the war. And that brings me now to some articles which have been appearing in the British media. There's an article in The Guardian which talks about the state of Ukraine's economy. It's by Peter Beaumont, a regular correspondent for The Guardian, by the way. He's a long-standing institution, I would almost, within The Guardian, or perhaps, to be more precise, The Observer, The Guardian Sunday edition, which still calls itself The Observer after the newspaper, which The Guardian acquired several decades ago. It used to be an entirely distinct newspaper, but the two merged quite a long time ago, and to all intents and purposes, The Observer seems to me to be essentially The Guardian's Sunday edition, though it tends to be, if anything, even more pro-war or pro-Ukraine than The Guardian itself is. Anyway, Peter Beaumont's article says, pawn shops and bread queues, poverty grips Ukraine as war drags on. And I'm not going to read the article because there's no real need to. It makes distressing reading. It talks about how more and more Ukrainians are struggling to make ends meet. They're running out of money. They're being forced to sell their personal possessions to buy food and to get by, and how the poverty rate in Ukraine is rising. And of that I am absolutely no doubt at all. Peter Beaumont also speaks about the fact that in Kiev, you still find bustling areas, attractive shops, boutiques, clubs, nightclubs, restaurants where people party like there is no tomorrow. Now, I have to say, this does remind me vividly of my own experiences in Moscow in the 1990s. I remember at that time that most of the country was in extremely dreadful conditions. Most of Russia was extremely dreadful conditions. But within Moscow itself, there was this appearance of affluence, which was accompanied by, frankly, frenetic activity of a rather hedonistic nature. And what, of course, connects these two events, the situation in Kiev with the situation in Moscow of that time, and I believe the same was true in Saigon in the 60s and in Kabul and in other places, is the fact that even as the real economy is collapsing, vast amounts of financial aid from the United States and the rest of the West flow in. And that creates a deeply surreal quality, because even as the real economy ceases to function to all intents and purposes, there remains an enormous amount of money circulating, except, of course, that money is not circulating in a natural way, as you would expect if the economy were operating normally. Rather, it goes to a small group of people who are in a position to directly access it. Civil servants or bureaucrats, if you like, certain types of military officers, part of the NGO community, the local NGO community, part of the Western community of advisors, the service sector that provides services and goods to some extent to these people, the business people who are involved in providing these services. And that does create this very anomalous situation of poverty and apparent affluence. And of course, because it is so unstable, and because there are such strong doubts on the part of those who have access to this wealth, this apparent wealth, about its permanence, there is a compulsion to spend it, and this spending can take the form of, well, the hedonistic activity that we hear about. So all this is very familiar to me, and it is consistent very much with what one would expect with a country like Ukraine, which is at war in the way that Ukraine is. And by the way, it is very much a product
of Western aid. It is consistent with the way in which countries that are recipients of Western aid in this kind of way tend to behave and tend to act within their economic system. And it's strange how this never changes, how Western aid continues always to be provided in the same kind of way, benefits the same sort of people, even as everyone else sinks into poverty. And of course, the other effect of all this flood of money pouring in this very distorted, unbalanced manner, is that it completely distorts the GDP statistics. It gives the impression that per capita GDP, personal wealth in other words, and the overall wealth of the country is much higher than it really is, because of course all this money pouring in raises that level without actually producing anything, possessing any degree of permanence. So when the aid spigot is turned off, it all collapses basically like a cake. Anyway, there we go. That's one rather sad article in The Guardian, and it's interesting, and well, perhaps one should say it's commendable that The Guardian at least has published an article like that, even though, as I said, Peter Beaumont's other articles on the Ukraine war are not ones which I would agree with at all. But there is another further article by The Guardian, which, of course, promotes or is intended to promote the offensive, except the Ukrainian offensive, except, of course, that even there, the doubts start to appear, because we find, for example, buried inside the article, a comment like this, and it says, "Dark," this is the name of a soldier, and there's lots of interviews of soldiers who struggle, by the way, Ukrainian soldiers who struggle, by the way, to be as optimistic as possible. They're clearly under orders, and this isn't surprising. I mean, journalists are not going to be allowed by the Ukrainian authorities to talk to soldiers without those soldiers being told, briefed carefully in advance about what they should say. But anyway, putting that aside, this particular soldier, who is called Dark, this is not obviously his real name, who is 30, is quoted as saying that someone has to defend the country. But then he goes on to say, we are not ready. We need to train more. We need more time. So Ukraine isn't ready to conduct the offensive. And then we're told elsewhere that Ukraine is going to face a major challenge, and that this might not work out. And we're also told that this time the Ukrainians are going to be facing a much more powerful enemy than they did in their previous offensives. They have to take on an enemy who we are told this time is, and I quote again, a larger, well-trained army that has been digging into its defensive positions for months. So, in effect, this is going to be a very different offensive from the last one. And this now then brings me to a further article, this time in CNN. And
this is an article I spoke about briefly yesterday. I said that a US general has said that Russia's military is bigger now than it was at the start of the war. And this article at CNN actually provides the full details. And the general in question was General Christopher Cavoli, the commander of US European Command. And it turns out that he was speaking to the House Armed Services Committee. And this is what he said. He said the Russian ground force has been degenerated somewhat by this conflict, although it is bigger today than it was at the beginning of the conflict. The Air Force has lost very little. They've lost 80 planes. They have another 1,000 fighters and fighter bombers. The Navy has lost one ship. The ship in question, by the way, is the Moskva. That's all that the Navy has lost. And then we hear further that Cavoli says that these losses that the Russians have suffered appear to be only a fraction, appear to have reduced by only a fraction Russia's total military force. Asked about Russia's submarine patrols in the Atlantic, Cavoli said that much of the Russian military has not been negatively affected. The Russians are more active than we've seen them in years, and their patrols into the Atlantic and throughout the Atlantic are at a high level, most of the time at a higher level than we've seen in years. And this, as you pointed out, despite all the efforts that they're undertaking inside Ukraine. And Cavoli, in fairness, does apparently take an optimistic point, a fairly optimistic, a tepidly optimistic view of the coming offensive. He's reported as saying that according to the modelling that we've carefully done with them, the Ukrainians are in a good position. There are some weaknesses that I prefer not to talk about in public, but we are confident in terms of their surprise and things like that. Of course, we've worked on all that with them. That doesn't sound massively optimistic to me. It admits that they have weaknesses. Anyway, I'm not going to say more. It doesn't seem to me that it brims with confidence about the prospects of this offensive. Now, on the topic of that offensive, which, as I said, we've seen it knocked about by the Russians with these missile strikes in Pavlograd and other places. There's been some speculation over the last couple of hours that the Ukrainian objectives might not be in Zaporozhye region at all, that this is a ruse, that the Ukrainians actually are going to strike in a completely different direction. And there's been some suggestions that Zelensky is pushing the Ukrainian military to do something much more radical, which is to advance into Russia itself. I say Russia, I mean pre-2014 Russia. Advance towards Belgorod, which is located 20 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, and capture Belgorod itself, a city, a Russian city of 375,000 people. Well, I would say this, I don't know whether that is a realistic objective. I am skeptical that it is the Ukrainian objective. If Ukraine were to launch an offensive in the direction of Belgorod, and if they were to attack and capture Belgorod, it would not end the war. It would provoke a massive Russian response going far beyond even what we've seen up till now. It would almost certainly consolidate even further demands within Russia for the war to be fought to Ukraine's total defeat. And I think it would be a huge mistake. Now, I say that there's a very weird article in Bloomberg which says that the Biden administration wants Ukraine's offensive to succeed, but not succeed too much. And it talks about, again, seeking some kind of negotiated settlement of the conflict. This idea that the United States can calibrate the war in that kind of way, it seems to me, is simply wrong. And the article also says that whatever happens, the Biden administration, Biden himself, in advance of the 2024 election, could find himself in a bind. Well, it seems to me it's not difficult to see what the administration should do. They should do what I said yesterday. Tell the Ukrainians to call this offensive off and to sit down and talk with the Russians, return, if possible, to the proposals that were almost agreed in Istanbul last year. And if the Russians push for more concessions, consider what those concessions are. And if they don't impinge on US core interests, tell the Ukrainians to agree to them. Certainly Ukraine will lose a lot more territory than it would have done if it had negotiated an agreement in March last year. But there we go. The other thing I would say is that these articles, and there's now a multiplicity of reports coming out, which says that the Biden administration, that the United States, does not actually want to see Ukraine join NATO. And that Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, when he came out after his visit in Kiev and after the NATO summit, and said that every single NATO country agrees that Ukraine should join NATO. Well, that obviously, if the United States, if the US government, if the Biden administration doesn't want to see that happen, well, then that is obviously wrong. And that the Biden administration is only looking to grant Ukraine some kind of bilateral security guarantee. That what that is, I have no idea. And the Russians might very well see that as the US forging some kind of alliance, which in effect makes Ukraine a member of NATO, but does it sort of in a kind of roundabout way. But what I would say about that is this: if the United States had simply said back in December 2021, when the Russians first proposed their draft treaties, or had said in the early months of 2022, before the fighting began, that the administration did not want Ukraine in NATO, that that possibility did not exist, that it was prepared to negotiate with the Russians a compromise whereby Ukraine would receive some kind of security guarantees but would never join NATO. And if the Russians had been invited to participate in that process, perhaps by granting Ukraine some kind of security guarantees themselves, perhaps linked to the implementation of the Minsk agreement, then the war would have been avoided. And all of those thousands of people who have died would not have died, and we would not be getting these disastrous landscapes in places like Marinka and Vuhledar and other places that I've seen, these terrible photographs, and all those people in Ukraine who've been immiserated as a result of this war would not be in that situation today, and all those millions of refugees who are in Europe would not have been driven from their homes and would not be now in Europe.
and economic and commercial links between Ukraine and Russia and the West would not have been severed. So, if that's really what the administration is thinking now, I'm going to say straight away, it does confirm the view of people like Joe Laurier and Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama, that the administration in its own way might be, or some people within the administration might be trying to find some sort of way out in advance of the US election next year. And this Bloomberg article does say that the United States is now anxious to avoid an open-ended military commitment to support of Ukraine, that it wants to see the war ended in some form. It doesn't want the war to continue at its present level of intensity next year, especially as the election looms. Well, all I will say is that if that is indeed the view, then, as I said, the view of Joe Laurier and Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama, that the administration, or some parts of it, the more realistic and rational parts of it, are looking for a way out, would be vindicated. But just think of the cost. All of this, as I said, could have been negotiated and agreed a year and a half ago, and this disaster could have been avoided. And by the way, a further sign that perhaps the administration is indeed, or at least, as I said, the more realistic, non-neocon parts of it, might be looking for a way out. Perhaps a further clue that that is the case is this latest interview that Angela Merkel has given. She seems to be trying to walk back the impression given by some of her earlier comments that the Minsk agreement was only intended to buy time for Ukraine to rearm. She now says that, in fact, she was trying to prevent the war taking place at all. Unlike many people, I'm inclined to give Merkel the benefit of the doubt on this, though that doesn't acquit her. She never actually did what the situation needed, which is to tell unequivocally the Ukrainians, and by the way, the Americans, that the Minsk agreement had to be implemented, or Germany would move to a position where it lifted the sanctions. It called on the European Union to lift the sanctions on Russia. That was always within Merkel's power to do, and she never did it, and for that reason, she is one of the key authors of the disaster that we have now. But the fact that she's coming out with these comments could be a sign, probably is a sign, that she too is picking up on the fact that the Biden administration might be looking for some sort of way out. Well, I'm going to say that, of course, the other side, the neocons, have not gone away. They are as anxious to press on with things, to go on fighting the war as always. And there's been an extremely angry editorial in the Daily Telegraph, an editorial comment that I have no doubt reflects the thinking, neocon thinking. I'm not going to read it all out. It's not very long, but it is behind a paywall. And it says that the Ukraine conflict has turned into a First World War style bloody stalemate, with forces dug in and battling over the occupation of towns and the capture of comparatively small tracts of land. The defending army hopes to mount a counteroffensive against the Russians, but appears handicapped by a lack of ammunition. And then there's an awful lot more of that.
And then it says that the West must replenish Ukraine's stockpile rapidly, yet it seems to be taking an age for NATO countries to agree to do so. Many have already given substantial amounts of ordnance from their own supplies and have yet to replace them. Ukrainian fighters understandably fear that Western resolve to help them will diminish the longer the war continues. So it's all the fault of a lack of will to save Ukraine. What we need is to increase our support to Ukraine even further. Never mind constraints, never mind concerns about depleted arsenals or all of that. If Ukraine loses the war, or if it's forced into a peace on less advantageous terms than might have been the case a year ago, because of overcommitment by the West, it's because the commitment was not great enough. And I predict that when this war ends, most probably with the Ukrainian defeat, we're going to hear an awful lot more of that argument coming in our direction. I'm going to finish this video with a brief mention of a very fine and interesting article by John Helmer at his website Dancing with Bears. Now, he's been looking at the submissions made in the first hearing involving Jack Teixeira, the person, the US soldier, the 21-year-old guardsman who published or is accused of publishing or leaking the Pentagon papers, the Pentagon leaks, the recent Pentagon leaks. And Helmer makes a number of very interesting points about the arguments made both by the prosecution and the defense. He suggests that the prosecution might be starting to row back some of the original claims that were made about Teixeira and about the claims that he was involved, that he broke the Espionage Act. He highlights the fact that some of these claims that Teixeira was a person who was obsessed with guns might be factually wrong. Most of the guns that he owned apparently were copy guns. They weren't real guns at all. They were the kind of things that are made to look like guns, but which actually aren't guns, about which, by the way, I happen to know that there is a substantial industry and customer base for them. But perhaps the most interesting thing in Helmer's article is that he suggested that potentially, conceivably, a plea bargain might be on the horizon, that Teixeira himself might only stay in prison for around a year, which would be very interesting indeed, and that the way in which the defense is being formulated might suggest that the defense will eventually argue, or could argue, in the event that there was no plea bargain, that Teixeira was actually manipulated by others higher up in the process, the hierarchy, the military hierarchy, into leaking these documents, that they were placed in front of him, if you wish, and that it was made easy for him, if you like, for him to leak them, because there are other people higher up the food chain who basically wanted those documents leaked. Now, all this is very early. We don't yet know exactly what the facts are. I did find Helmer's article interesting, and it's certainly something to keep an eye out. Certainly, Ray McGovern,
former CIA official and a very senior analyst in the CIA, somebody who used to carry out the president's daily brief, for example. He, on balance, does think that this leak involved people much more important than Teixeira. And Larry Johnson, another CIA veteran, has hinted that he thinks most likely the same thing. So let's wait and see what more comes out, but certainly that there is an argument going on within the US government about where to take this war in Ukraine. That, it seems to me, is indisputable. Well, that's me for today. There'll be more from me soon on many other things, no doubt, but undoubtedly, principally for the time being at least, about the war in Ukraine. Just to say again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop and buy yourself the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those fine things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon.